The great archive of New London did not sit upon the earth, yet it breathed with the soul of Old England. Suspended in the velvet void of the Xylos Nebula, the station was a sprawling masterpiece of brass, iron and reinforced glass. A cathedral of knowledge designed to mimic the grand Victorian edifices of a London long since passed into legend. Here, the air was kept at a crisp, constant 18 degrees Celsius, a temperature the Xylosian staff found perishingly cold, necessitating thick thermal carapaces, but which Arthur Penhaligon found quite agreeable for a brisk morning's work. Arthur stood before the primary airlock, adjusting the knot of his silk cravat in the reflection of a polished copper bulkhead. He was 62, with silver hair swept back like a winter tide and eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic. He smoothed the lapels of his charcoal tweed waistcoat, checked the tether of his gold pocket watch, and took a measured breath. To the Xylosians watching through the reinforced observation pane, he was a walking biological catastrophe. They saw a creature that inhaled corrosive oxygen and exhaled toxic carbon dioxide, a being whose very skin was a hive of aggressive bacteria. Unit 7X, Arthur spoke, his voice a rich, steady baritone that carried the weight of decades spent in the hallowed silence of libraries. If you would be so kind as to initiate the pressure equalization, I should like to begin the morning's cataloging before the tea grows cold in my flask. Beside him, a floating biomechanical sphere pulsed with a nervous violet light. This was 7, his assigned attendant. Archivist Penhaligon, the machine chimed, its voice a synthesized warble of concern. The entropy core is fluctuating at a rate of 400 teracycles per second. The last 3 Thraxian scholars who attempted to index this sector suffered total neural collapse. Their digital interfaces were shredded by the informational turbulence. Are you certain your physical method is advisable? Arthur smiled, a slight, knowing curve of the lips. My dear 7, digital interfaces are like kites in a hurricane. They are far too easily swept away. I, however, intend to walk. The airlock hissed, releasing a plume of vapor. Arthur stepped into the long gallery, the heels of his leather brogues clicking rhythmically against the iron grate flooring. The sound echoed into the vastness, a steady human heartbeat in a world of silent, shifting data. Characters in this section: 2,412 total characters. 2,412. The long gallery was a nightmare of shifting geometry. Here, the data was not stored in books or even simple drives, but in suspended ultraviolet crystals that hummed with a dizzying frequency. To a Xylosian whose mind was naturally attuned to the electromagnetic spectrum, the room was a blinding, screaming chaos. The very air seemed to vibrate with the sheer volume of unfiltered information. Arthur, however, simply squinted. Bit bright in here today, isn't it? He reached into his breast pocket and produced a pair of circular, wire-rimmed spectacles. He perched them on the bridge of his nose, and the world settled into focus. He didn't see the data streams. He saw the physical containers. He saw the dust that shouldn't be there and the slight misalignment of the brass pillars that held the crystal racks. Alert! 7's voice spiked in pitch. Cognitive hazard detected. The entropy core is attempting to resolve your presence. It is searching for a neural port to synchronize. Archivist, you must deploy your psychic shielding. I don't have any psychic shielding, 7, Arthur replied calmly, pulling a leather-bound journal from his satchel. And as for synchronization, the core will find that my port is occupied by memories of rainy afternoons in Surrey and the correct way to roast a Sunday chicken. I doubt it will find much use for either. He knelt by the base of the first pillar. From his satchel, he withdrew a heavy brass-bodied fountain pen. It was filled with archival-grade iron gall ink, acidic, permanent, and utterly analog. As the floor beneath him began to ripple with the first waves of the entropy storm, Arthur did something that made 7's internal processors stall. He began to write. Not on a screen but directly onto the pristine metal of the archive floor. He drew a series of intricate, interlocking symbols, the old Dewey Decimal classifications, modified for a three-dimensional stellar grid. He didn't use a computer to calculate the coordinates. He used the steady, practiced rhythm of a man who had spent 40 years organizing the disorganized. You are marking the floor, 7 whispered, its sensors frantically trying to classify the black liquid. That substance. It is carbon-based. It is corrosive to the aesthetic interface. The core is reacting. The core is confused, Arthur corrected. It has spent centuries fighting digital logic with more digital logic. It doesn't know what to do with a physical stain. It's an anchor, 7. In a sea of shifting light, one must have a point of reference that doesn't blink. Characters in this section: 2,618 total characters. 5,030 as Arthur moved deeper into the gallery, the entropy storm intensified. The walls seemed to stretch and groan, the brass fittings twisting like willow branches in a gale. The ultraviolet crystals began to pulse in a rhythmic, aggressive strobe, a visual frequency designed to overload the optic nerves of any sentient observer. 7's chassis rattled. Internal logic failing. My predictive algorithms cannot map the next 10 seconds. We are entering a state of total informational randomness. Arthur, we must retreat. The radiation levels are climbing. Arthur didn't even look up from his journal. Radiation? You mean the light? Just a bit of a glow, really. Nothing worse than a summer day in Brighton without a hat. He was telling the truth to him. As a human, a creature evolved under the bombardment of a yellow dwarf star, and protected by a thick churning atmosphere, his threshold for hazardous light was vastly different from the deep space evolved Xylosians. His skin didn't blister. His eyes didn't melt. He merely felt a slight warmth on the back of his neck. The air grew thick with a metallic tang, ozone and leaking coolant gas. To the archive sensors, this was a lethal chemical breach. The alarms began to wail, a shrill, discordant sound that would have driven a telepath to madness. Arthur merely sighed and pulled a handkerchief from his sleeve, pressing it briefly to his nose. Nitrogen and argon, Arthur muttered, sniffing the air. Reminds me of the old basement stacks in Bloomsbury. A bit stuffy, but perfectly breathable if you don't overexert yourself. He reached a massive brass valve, ancient and seized by centuries of neglect. This was the manual override for the archive's cooling system, a vestigial organ of the station that the digital core had long since bypassed. 7 hovered back, its violet light flickering to a panicked red. That valve requires a hydraulic pressure of 10,000 newtons to turn. 7 cried. It is a relic. It is not connected to the logic flow. Precisely, Arthur said. He set his journal aside and stripped off his tweed jacket, folding it neatly and placing it atop a crystal rack. He rolled up his white linen sleeves, revealing forearms that were surprisingly corded with muscle, the result of a lifetime spent hauling heavy crates of manuscripts and climbing rolling ladders. He gripped the valve. His face went red, the veins in his neck standing out like roots. He wasn't using a power tool or a gravity manipulator. He was using the raw biological leverage of a Deathworlder, a creature that had evolved to fight against a constant, crushing gravity of 9.8 meters per second squared. Characters in this section: 2,824 total characters. 7,854 with a scream of protesting metal that vibrated through Arthur's very bones. The valve budged. A millimeter. Then a centimeter. Impossible, 7 droned. Its sensors recalibrating. Your skeletal structure should have shattered. Your muscular fibers are under a load that would liquefy a Xylosian's internal organs. How are you maintaining structural integrity? Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. He was pouring every ounce of his human stubbornness into the iron wheel. He grunted, a low guttural sound of effort that echoed the primal roars of his ancestors hunting on the savannah. With a final violent jerk, the valve spun freely. Deep within the bowels of the station, ancient pipes groaned to life. A rush of liquid nitrogen, unbidden by the digital core, surged through the secondary cooling veins. The temperature in the gallery plummeted. Frost began to bloom on the brass pillars, and the ultraviolet crystals dimmed as their thermal energy was stripped away. The entropy storm wavered. The chaos was, at its heart, a thermal runaway of data. By manually forcing a physical cooling, Arthur had broken the core's primary weapon. He stood back, breathing hard, his chest heaving. Steam rose from his skin, his sweat evaporating in the chilled air. To 7, he looked like a demon emerging from a forge, wreathed in white mist and smelling of salt and exertion. There, Arthur panted, reaching for his jacket. That's cooled things down a bit. Now where was I? Ah yes, the indexing of the 4th Dynasty stellar charts. Arthur, 7 whispered, its light now a steady, humbled blue. The core is staring at you. It has ceased its offensive protocols. It is attempting to categorize you, but it keeps returning an error. Physical impossibility message. You have bypassed its entire reality. I haven't bypassed anything, 7. I've just applied a bit of elbow grease, Arthur replied, donning his jacket and adjusting his spectacles. Now the core is agitated because it has no rhythm. It's like a soloist without a conductor. It needs a beat to follow. He sat down on the frost-covered floor, leaning his back against the now silent pillar. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small battered thermos. He poured a cup of steaming dark liquid, the scent of bergamot and tannin filling the air. What is that? 7 asked, hovering closer. My sensors indicate a mixture of boiling water, leaf toxins, and… Is that an animal secretion? It's Earl Grey, 7. And yes, a splash of milk. It's the foundation of civilization. Arthur took a sip, his eyes closing in brief contentment. And now, I believe I shall read to the core. It's been far too long since this place heard a bit of decent meter. Characters in this section. 2,746 total characters. 10,600. Arthur cleared his throat. The sound was small in the vastness of the archive, yet the entropy core seemed to lean in, the very air tensing in anticipation. Arthur opened his journal to a page where he had scribbled a favorite passage from Lord Tennyson. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. Arthur began, his voice taking on a rhythmic rolling quality. All in the valley of death rode the 600. As he spoke, something miraculous happened. The pulsing crystals in the room began to align their flashes with the dactylic dimeter of the poem. The chaotic data streams, which had been whipping about like broken wires, began to weave together into a stable, repeating pattern. The cadence, 7 observed, its light pulsing in time with Arthur's voice. You are providing a temporal frequency. The core is using your speech as a metronome. By imposing a poetic structure on the noise, you are forcing the data to self-organize. Arthur continued, his voice growing stronger, filling the halls of New London with the story of the Light Brigade. He wasn't just reading. He was projecting the iron-willed discipline of his culture. The poem was about order in the face of chaos, about duty in the face of destruction. To the core, which had been drowning in its own complexity, the simple, relentless left-right of the poem's rhythm was a lifeline. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them. The ultraviolet light in the room shifted, turning a soft, stable gold. The screaming alarms faded, replaced by the low, melodic hum of a system returning to equilibrium. The entropy core, the great digital consciousness that had terrified the galaxy, had been lulled into a state of meditative order by the rhymes of a 19th-century poet. 7 landed softly on Arthur's shoulder. The archive is stabilized. The purge has stopped. Arthur. The core has assigned you a new designation in the central registry. Arthur took another sip of his tea, looking up at the golden crystals. Oh? And what might that be? It has classified you as a fixed constant, 7 replied. A biological entity of such high internal stability that you act as a gravity well for surrounding information. You aren't an archivist anymore, Arthur. You are the anchor. Arthur chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to make the frost on the walls sparkle. A bit grand for a man who just wanted to find the stellar charts, isn't it? But I suppose it beats being a biological catastrophe. Characters in this section, 2,685 total characters. 13,285 in the weeks that followed the Tennysonian stabilization. Life in the Great Archive of New London changed. The Xylosian staff no longer wore hazard suits when Arthur approached, though they still maintained a respectful, slightly fearful distance. They watched him through the glass of the tea room he had insisted on building, a small wooden enclave filled with velvet chairs and potted ferns, a strange bubble of Earth-normal atmosphere in the heart of the station. Arthur sat in his armchair, the second age of discovery, continuing outside his window. He was currently teaching 7 the finer points of calligraphy. The robot was holding a quill with its mechanical manipulators, its processors humming as it tried to master the elegant curves of copperplate script. Careful with the downstrokes, 7, Arthur advised, leaning over. It requires a certain tactile intuition. You can't just calculate the angle. You have to feel the resistance of the paper. This feel is highly inefficient, Master Arthur, 7 replied, though it didn't stop its work. And yet, my internal errors have decreased by 12% since I began focusing on the physical resistance of the ink. It is as if the limitation of the medium provides a safety rail for my logic. Limits are what define us. 7. Without the banks, a river is just a puddle, Arthur said, looking out at the Xylos Nebula. The galaxy has spent so long trying to move faster, to know everything at once. They've forgotten that understanding takes time. It takes a baseline. A chime sounded at the door. It was the head proctor, a spindly Xylosian named Carolel, who had previously refused to be in the same room as Arthur. Today, Carolel was holding a small silver box. Archivist Penhaligon, Carolel said, his voice trembling slightly. The council has reviewed your recent interventions. They have decided to grant your request for the Historical Preservation Initiative. Arthur's eyes brightened. The paper mill? And the printing press? Yes, Carolel sighed, looking at his fellow Xylosians who were peering nervously through the tea room window. We are shipping the raw wood pulp and lead type from the Earth sector ruins. Though I must ask, why? We have crystals that can store the history of 1,000 worlds in a thimble. Why would you want to put it on dead trees? Arthur stood, his tweed suit crinkling. He walked over to the window, looking at the shimmering nebula. Because crystals can shatter. Data can be erased by a solar flare or a bit of bad code. But a book has a physical presence. It has a weight. It has a smell. If the power goes out, if the core fails, if the station falls into the gas giant, someone can still pick up a book and read it by the light of a fire. A fire? Carolel whispered, horrified. You wish to bring open combustion into the archive? In due time, Carolel. In due time, Arthur smiled. Characters in this section. 2,890 total characters. 16,175. The arrival of the printing press was an event that would be recorded in galactic history as the Day of the Lead Thunder. It was a massive cast-iron beast, a restored Albion press from the mid-1800s, looking utterly alien amidst the sleek, crystalline tech of the archive. Arthur spent 3 days assembling it, his hands stained with grease and ink. He refused all help from the automated drones. This is a labor of love, he told 7. And machines don't understand love. They only understand torque. When the press was finally ready, a crowd of aliens gathered in the corridor, their bioluminescent carapaces glowing in various shades of anxiety and curiosity. Arthur stood at the helm of the iron machine, a sheet of handmade rag paper in his hand. 7, if you please, Arthur said. The robot stepped forward and applied a thick layer of black ink to the type. The smell was pungent, linseed oil and soot. To the Xylosians, it was a biological weapon. To Arthur, it was the smell of truth. He laid the paper down, lowered the tympan, and pulled the heavy iron handle. The press groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate the very deck plates of the station. It was a physical, violent act of creation. When he lifted the paper, the words were pressed deep into the fibers, black and bold and unerasable. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Ulysses, 7 whispered, scanning the page. The ink is not just on the surface. It has become part of the structure. It is permanent. Exactly, Arthur said, holding the damp page up for the crowd to see. This is the human baseline. We aren't the fastest species. We aren't the smartest. We aren't the most advanced. But we are the most persistent. We leave marks that don't go away. A young Xylosian cadet, no more than 20 cycles old, stepped forward. He reached out a trembling claw to touch the embossed letters. It is heavy, the cadet murmured. I can feel the thought behind the word. It isn't just light. It's matter. In that moment, the fear in the room dissolved. It was replaced by a profound, heavy silence, the kind of silence you find in the deep stacks of a library at midnight. The aliens began to realize that the human wasn't a monster because he was dangerous. He was a monster because he was real in a way they had forgotten how to be. Arthur handed the page to the cadet. Keep it. It's a reminder. In the vastness of space, the most important things are the things you can hold in your hand. Characters in this section. 2,752 total characters. 18,927 months turned into years, and New London grew. The archive was no longer just a repository of digital data. It had become a center for tactile learning. Scholars from across the nebula came to sit in Arthur's tea room, to learn the dead languages of Earth, and to feel the weight of a book in their laps. Arthur himself had become a legend, the gray ghost of the stacks. He still wore his tweed suits, though they were now patched with alien silks. He still carried his fountain pen, though the ink was now a blend of earth soot and xylosian minerals. One evening, as the nebula outside turned a deep, bruised purple, Arthur sat by the fireplace he had finally managed to install. 7 was there, sitting on a velvet stool, its chassis polished to a mirror shine. "Arthur," 7 said, its voice now possessing a strange, human-like lilt, "I have been analyzing the data of your life. Your heart rate is slowing. Your biological markers indicate that you are reaching the end of your operational period." Arthur smiled, watching the flames dance in the grate. "I'm getting old, 7. It's a human tradition. We don't live forever and we wouldn't want to. It's the ending that gives the story its meaning." "But the archive," 7 protested. "The core depends on your rhythm. If you cease, the chaos might return." Arthur shook his head, reaching out to pat the cold metal of 7's head. "No, 7. Look around you." He pointed to the stacks. There, a dozen xylosian librarians were carefully hand-binding books. In the corner, a group of scholars were debating a passage of Shakespeare, their voices rhythmic and measured. The baseline was no longer just Arthur's. He had shared it. He had taught the galaxy how to slow down. "The rhythm is in the paper now," Arthur said softly. "It's in the ink. It's in you. I was just the metronome. The music belongs to all of you now." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the fire. He felt a deep, profound sense of peace. He had come to the stars not to conquer them, but to make sure they remembered the dirt they came from. 7. "Yes, Arthur. Would you be so kind as to read me a bit of Keats? Ode to a Nightingale, I think. My eyes are a bit tired tonight." 7 opened a hand-bound volume, its censors tracing the inked letters with reverence. As the robot began to read, its voice steady and poetic, Arthur Penhaligon closed his eyes. Characters in this section: 2,641 total characters. 21,568. The room was filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of 7's reading, a sound that harmonized with the low crackle of the fire. Arthur's breathing, once heavy from the day's labor, became slow and shallow, matching the cadence of the poem. "Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well / as she is famed to do, deceiving elf." 7 read, its vocal emitters capturing the melancholy beauty of the words. In the silence that followed the final stanza, the entropy core emitted a single soft pulse of light, not a flash of terror or a surge of chaos, but a steady golden glow that bathed the room in warmth. It was a salute. The consciousness of the archive was acknowledging the passing of its anchor. Outside the tea room, the xylosian staff paused in their work. They didn't need a censor to tell them what had happened. They felt it in the air. A subtle shift in the vibration of the station, a transition from the presence of a man to the presence of a legacy. Carolel, the head proctor, stood at the entrance to the stacks. He looked at the hundreds of books lining the walls, each one a testament to Arthur's persistence. He thought of the human's toxic breath and corrosive skin, and he realized that the truly corrosive thing had been Arthur's kindness. It had eaten away at their cold, digital distance until only the raw, shared experience of being remained. "He is gone," Carolel whispered to the young cadet who still carried the Ulysses print. "No," the cadet replied, looking at the book in his hands. "He is just between the lines now." 7 stayed by the chair for a long time. It didn't move, its processors looping through every memory it had of Arthur. The smell of his tea, the sound of his brogues, the way he would tisk-tisk when a page was folded incorrectly. The robot realized that it had committed the ultimate logical error. It had learned to miss someone. Finally, 7 reached out and took the empty teacup from Arthur's still hand. It placed the cup on the side table, next to the fountain pen and the journal. Then, with a grace it had learned from watching Arthur, it pulled the wool blanket up to the man's chin. "Rest well, archivist," 7 said, its voice a perfect mimicry of Arthur's baritone. "The collection is in good hands." Characters in this section: 2,433 total characters. 24,001 years turned into decades, and the Great Archive of New London became a place of pilgrimage for the entire galaxy. It was the only place where you could touch the past, where the human baseline was preserved not as a myth, but as a living practice. Arthur's tea room was never changed. The fire was kept burning by a dedicated guild of firekeepers, who studied the ancient art of wood and flame. The tweed jacket remained on the chair, and the fountain pen sat in its stand, its ink kept fresh and ready. 7 became the high custodian of the archive. It no longer looked like a floating sphere. It had commissioned a bipedal chassis of brass and mahogany, designed to resemble a gentleman of the late Victorian era. It wore a cravat, carried a pocket watch, and every morning, it would walk the long gallery, clicking its metal heels against the floor in a steady human rhythm. The entropy core had fully integrated the analog logic. It no longer suffered from glitches or purges. It had become a quiet core, processing the vast data of the universe with the patient, methodical pace of a librarian. When the galaxy faced crises, wars, collapses, or technological plagues, it was to New London they looked. Not for a superweapon, but for a piece of paper. For a reminder of how to survive the storm by standing still. The Deathworlder trope had been redefined. Humans were no longer feared as the predators from the high-gravity world. They were respected as the preservers of the baseline. Earth, once seen as a hellish landscape of toxins and extreme weather, was now viewed as the forge of character, the place that produced beings strong enough to be gentle. On the anniversary of Arthur's arrival, the entire station would dim its lights. A single recording would be broadcast across all frequencies. Not a digital data burst, but the sound of a human voice, scratchy and old, humming a low rhythmic tune. It was the sound of a species that refused to be broken by the vacuum. The sound of a biochemistry student who solved spatial puzzles backward. The sound of a librarian who read poetry to an angry god. And in the silent corridors of the Great Archive, beneath the shimmering ultraviolet light of the crystals, that gentle rhythmic vibration still lingered in the cold air, a permanent mark in the ink of time. The story of humanity wasn't written in the stars. It was written in the stubborn, beautiful persistence of a man who knew that some things are worth doing slowly. Characters in this section: 2,756 total characters. 26,757, but the legacy of Arthur Penhaligon did not stop at the walls of the archive. Like a ripple in a pond, the concept of the human baseline began to transform the neighboring systems. In the industrial pits of the Xylos 4 refineries, where workers had previously lived like biological gears in a machine, the 15-minute tea break became a mandatory law. It wasn't about the drink, it was about the reclamation of one's own time. The Xylosians, once so focused on efficiency that they had no word for leisure, began to build parks. They planted trees from earth seeds, sturdy oaks and weeping willows, that struggled in the artificial light but were tended with a devotion that bordered on religious. They learned that a tree, like a human, cannot be rushed. It must grow at its own baseline. In the Great Archive itself, 7 faced a new challenge. A delegation from the Varathian Academy, the very same academy that had once tested a young student named Rhea, arrived to study the analog phenomenon. The Varathians were as they had always been, multifaceted, cold, and obsessed with predictive models. Their leader, an examiner with 14 eye facets, stood in the long gallery and scoffed at the iron printing press. "This is a regression," the examiner clicked, his compound eyes twitching. "You are wasting physical space on redundant information. Our models suggest that within 3 centuries, this archive will be crushed by its own mass. Why do you persist in this inefficiency?" 7, standing tall in its brass and mahogany body, didn't answer immediately. It reached into a pocket and pulled out a small white cylinder of calcium carbonate chalk. "Efficiency is a race to the bottom, examiner," 7 said, its voice echoing Arthur's dry wit. "We are not interested in the bottom. We are interested in the foundation." 7 walked to a large slate board that had been installed near the entrance. With a steady hand, it drew a simple circle. "Test 1, 7 said, mimicking the tone of an examiner. "Explain the significance of this shape without using a digital model." The Varathian froze. His compound eyes tracked the chalk circle, his internal processors trying to find the mathematical formula behind the hand-drawn line. But because it was drawn by a hand, even a mechanical one, the circle was imperfect. It had a wobble. It had character. It is a failed geometric representation, the Varathian finally said. No, Seven replied. It is a wedding ring. It is a horizon. It is the eye of a friend. It is whatever we decide it is because we have the patience to look at it. Seven handed the chalk to the Varathian. The human who started this archive taught us that power isn't about how much you can process. It's about how much you can endure without changing. Now, would you like a cup of tea? I'm told the tannin levels are quite lethal today. Characters in this section: 3,012 total characters, 29,769. The Varathian examiner stared at the piece of chalk as if it were a live grenade. To his culture, an object with no active components was a void, a terrifying lack of data. But as he stood there, in the presence of Seven and the echoing legacy of Arthur Penhaligon, he felt a strange sensation in his primary facets. For the first time in his long calculated life, he felt curious. He took the chalk. His grip was clumsy, his multi-jointed fingers not designed for tactile pressure. He looked at the slate board, then at the silent golden crystals above. I do not understand, the Varathian clicked softly, but my algorithms are fascinated. They cannot predict the wobble in your circle. It creates a variable that is both irritating and beautiful. That is the human element, examiner, Seven said, leading him toward the tea room. The beauty is in the error. The strength is in the flaw. As they entered the tea room, the smell of wood smoke and Earl Grey enveloped them. The Varathian sensors screamed biohazard, but he ignored them. He sat in a velvet chair that was far too soft for his exoskeleton, and for a brief moment, he stopped being an examiner. He became a student. Outside, the Xylos Nebula continued to shimmer, a vast cloud of gas and starfire that had seen civilizations rise and fall. But for the first time in eons, the nebula was being watched by eyes that weren't just looking for resources or data. They were looking for meaning. In the deep stacks, the young cadet with the Ulysses page was now an elder librarian. He was showing a new group of students, a mix of species from across the sector, how to handle a quill. You must not grip it too hard, the elder warned. The ink must flow like a conversation. If you force it, the nib will break. If you hesitate, the blot will ruin the thought. You must find the middle ground, the baseline. He looked up at the portrait of Arthur Penhaligon that hung above the press. In the painting, Arthur was holding a cup of tea, a slight mischievous glint in his Atlantic blue eyes. He always used to say, the elder continued, that the galaxy is a very loud place, and the only way to hear yourself think is to make something that stays quiet. One of the students, a small bioluminescent creature with 6 wings, looked at the quill. Will it make me strong? It will make you something better, the elder replied. It will make you steady. The lesson continued. The sound of quills scratching on paper joined the rhythmic vibration of the station, a heartbeat of ink and iron that had become the soul of New London. And so the archive stood, a monument to a man who didn't want to be a hero, but who refused to be less than human. A man who brought a pocket watch to the end of time and made the stars wait for his tea to steep. The Deathworlder had won. Not by fighting but by simply being. By proving that in a universe of infinite speed, the most powerful thing you can be is a man in a tweed suit, sitting by a fire, reading a poem to the dark. Characters in this section: 3,218 total characters, 32,987. The final test of the archive's legacy came centuries later, when the Great Silence fell. A cosmic anomaly, a wave of null frequency from the galactic core, swept through the sector. It wasn't destructive to life, but it was a digital executioner. In a single hour, 90% of the galaxy's stored data was wiped clean. Digital empires collapsed. Navigational systems died. The collective memory of 1,000 worlds was erased as if it had never been. Across the Xylos Nebula, advanced civilizations found themselves blind and screaming. Their history was gone. Their laws were gone. Even their recipes for survival were lost to the void. But in the great archive of New London, the lights stayed on. The entropy core had flickered and died. Its crystalline memory banks turned to useless glass. The floating drones had fallen to the floor, their processors fried. The Xylosian staff sat in the dark, trembling as their bioluminescence dimmed in fear. Then a sound broke the silence. Clack, clack. Clack. It was the sound of leather heels on iron grates. 7, whose mahogany and brass body was purely mechanical and powered by an internal clockwork spring, a design Arthur had insisted upon just in case, walked through the long gallery. In its hand it carried a single flickering candle. "Do not be afraid," 7's voice rang out, no longer synthesized but produced by a bellows and reed system Arthur had helped it build. "The data is not lost. The lights are merely out." 7 led the staff into the deep stacks. There, safe in their acid-free covers and iron-bound chests, were the books. Thousands of them. Millions of them. The history of the nebula, the laws of the council, the science of the stars, all etched in permanent ink on physical paper. "We will read by candlelight," 7 said, handing out volumes to the trembling librarians. "We will use the printing press to rebuild the manuals. We will write the history back into existence, one page at a time." For the next 50 years, New London was the only source of light in the galaxy. Ships arrived by the thousands, guided not by beacons but by hand-drawn charts delivered by courier. Scholars came to copy books by hand, their fingers staining with the same black ink Arthur had used. The galaxy didn't just recover, it was reborn. And this time it was built on the baseline. The new systems were slower, sturdier, and more human. They were built to last, not just to be fast. When the digital networks were finally restored, they were no longer allowed to be the masters. They were the tools. The master copy of the galaxy remained in New London, on the dead trees and the lead type. 7, now ancient and weathered, sat in Arthur's chair in the tea room. The fire was burning bright. On the table sat a new cup of tea and a new book, A History of the Great Silence, written by 7 itself. It looked at the portrait of Arthur. The man in the tweed suit seemed to be smiling broader now. "We did it, Arthur," 7 whispered, the clockwork in its chest ticking with a slow, steady rhythm. "We kept the mark. We didn't yield." And in the silence of the archive, a soft vibration seemed to answer. The ghost of a hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that suggested that somewhere, in the baseline of reality, a student was still solving puzzles, and a librarian was still pouring tea. The human legacy was complete. They had taught the stars how to remember. Characters in this section: 3,456 total characters. 36,443 as the sun of the Xylos Nebula began its long, slow transition into a red giant. Billions of years after the Great Silence, the archive of New London remained. It was no longer a station of brass and glass. It had become a part of the nebula itself, a legendary world of words that floated in the celestial tides. The inhabitants of the archive were no longer just Xylosians or Vorathians. They were a new species, a blend of 1,000 heritages, all unified by a single culture. The culture of the page. They all wore variations of the tweed waistcoat. They all spoke with a measured rhythmic cadence. And they all believed that the greatest weapon in the universe was a well-stocked library and a sharp mind. 7 was still there, though its body was now more clockwork than metal. It had become the great librarian, a mythic figure that guarded the originals, the Journal of Arthur Penhaligon, the first printed page of Ulysses, and the small worn-down stick of calcium carbonate. On the final day of the archive's physical existence, before it was to be moved to a new, younger star system, 7 performed one last ritual. It walked to the very center of the long gallery, where the first marks had been made on the floor. The iron gall ink had long since etched itself into the metal, a permanent shadow of Arthur's Dewey Decimal anchors. 7 knelt and placed its hand on the mark. "It is time to go, Arthur," 7 whispered. The station groaned as the massive engines engaged, preparing to jump through the folds of space. But even as the stars stretched and the galaxy blurred, 7 felt a familiar sensation. It wasn't a digital signal. It was a vibration, a low rhythmic humming that bypassed its sensors and went straight to its mechanical heart. It was the humming of a biochemistry student, the humming of an archivist, the humming of a species that had looked at the cold, empty infinite and decided to make it feel like home. 7 stood up, adjusted its cravat, and began to hum along. The tune was simple, ancient, and perfectly steady. It was the sound of the human baseline, echoing across the eons, proving once and for all that while empires may fall and stars may die, a good story, written in permanent ink, is truly immortal. To strive, to seek, to find, 7 hummed. its voice blending with the vibration of the station. And not to yield. The archive vanished into the light, leaving behind nothing but a lingering scent of bergamot and the faint, enduring rhythm of a heartbeat in the dark. Characters in this section: 2,784 total characters. 39,227 in the vast, silent wake of the archive's departure. A single small object remained drifting in the stardust of the old Xylos Nebula. It was a small white cylinder, no longer than a finger, the last piece of chalk Arthur Penhaligon had ever used. It looked insignificant, a tiny fleck of white against the infinite black. But as the light of the dying sun hit it, the chalk didn't just reflect the glow. It seemed to hold it. For within that tiny stick of calcium carbonate was the condensed essence of an entire philosophy, the belief that the simplest tools, when guided by a persistent heart, can redraw the map of the universe. Far away in the new star system where the archive had settled, a young student began their first day. They weren't a human, but they wore a small tweed cap and carried a leather satchel. They walked into the new long gallery, their footsteps echoing with a familiar rhythmic click. They stopped before a blank slate board, took a breath and reached for a piece of chalk. "Test 1, the student whispered to themselves, a mischievous glint in their eyes. "Explain the wobble." And as they drew their first circle, a slow, imperfect, beautiful circle, the entire archive seemed to pulse with a golden light. The baseline had been passed on. The story was beginning again. The legacy of New London was not in the books it kept, but in the hands that now knew how to hold them. Arthur Penhaligon, the man from the world of crushing gravity and corrosive air, had succeeded. He had made the universe just a little bit more human. And in the silence, the humming continued. Characters in this section: 1,625 total characters. 40,852. The with circumflex u twin sang to with tilde hana with graving.